I bring greetings to Uongozi, our cherished partners in Tanzania, and our partners from the World Bank and the German Marshall Fund. There is no better way to commemorate the International Day of Rural Women, as well as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, both days which fall on consecutive days in October, than through this partnership with Uongozi, the Leadership Institute in Tanzania, that was forged as a partnership between the government of Tanzania and the government of Finland. Then, by advancing and celebrating the leadership potential of women in business and in agribusiness to lead public policy and public service. So on behalf of the Women in Public Service project that was launched by Secretary Hillary Clinton in December of 2011, I'm delighted to celebrate with our sisters in Tanzania the power, the transformative power of women leading their businesses, their communities, and their countries. As the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen said best, nothing is as important in the political economy of development as the leadership and empowerment of women. And more recently, the Harvard Business Review stated that women's leadership and women's empowerment is the bright thing to do. And even more recently, 40 leaders of Fortune 500 companies proclaimed that gender equality is good business. So we are here today to celebrate with you women's leadership as a cornerstone of good business and the importance of public-private partnerships in advancing that value. And I'm thrilled to have with me experts in the field who will help to bolster that bedrock of good business and public policy. I'm joined by my colleague, Katrin Kuhlmann, whom you all know, who is a fellow at the German Marshall Fund and is the founder of New Markets Lab. I'm also joined by two leaders of the Women in Public Service project who are part of the 50 by 50 Leadership Circle. Raj Sharma, who is the founder of Sensio Consulting and also the co-founder of the Center for Innovation and Public Value. And Shelley Kapoor Collins, who is the founder of Ancient Corporation. Both of these speakers are innovators, entrepreneurs, and visionary leaders. And I'm delighted most of all to partner with Katrin Kuhlmann, a friend, a cherished friend and colleague, who, as the representative of the German Marshall Fund, will be co-moderating this session with me and will help to set the stage for the program that will follow. This particular panel is just the beginning of our journey with all of you. It's the first step towards an enduring, sustainable partnership. And this program will help to set the tone for a series of leadership seminars that we hope to forge with all of you. And going forward, we will work together with all of you to enrich a discussion that will advance women's agribusiness in Tanzania and in the region, and will help promote women's leadership in public service around the world. Katrin?
Thank you so much, Rangita. I am honored to be doing this work with you and to be part of this very esteemed panel today. I just want to give a brief introduction to the project that we are here to discuss And we'll speak a bit more later on about some of the particular issues that I hope will come out in the conversation. But we are really, really pleased to be part of this collaboration with the Women's Leadership Initiative here at the Woodrow Wilson Center and with Rangita. It is, I think, a perfect match, and I think there's no question that women's leadership in the agricultural sector in Tanzania is something that we need to look very closely at as we think about how to create transformational partnerships. It's the transformational partnership piece that has brought us together, and a project that the German Marshall Fund has launched called the Center of Excellence for Transformational Partnerships. We are starting this project in Tanzania, looking for good models, for things that have worked, for challenges that we all face on how we can advance public-private partnership and create more opportunity for women and for others in the market. And so that project is part of the conversation here today, again, to look for case studies, for models, for training, for catalytic policy and institutional reform, which is something that we'll be discussing with leaders and with you later in the week. I will wait then and discuss a bit more of the context around which we are going to be continuing the discussion this afternoon. But I did want to just briefly also introduce my organization, the New Markets Lab. We're created to focus on legal and regulatory reform, but to do it in a slightly different way, in a way that's more participatory, in a way that's more equitable, and in a way that actually brings forward some of the potential in the market that is yet untapped. So I hope that today, as we have this conversation around the different aspects of women's leadership, that we can think both about what's happening now that presents a challenge to us, but also what could be happening, because I think that there is so much more that we have yet to explore. And as Rangita has said, we hope that this is the beginning of a long conversation that we can have over the course of the next months and hopefully upcoming years as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. As I said yesterday, the world commemorated rural women as well as rural women's right to land. 70% of the world's women live in rural areas and are based in agriculture. Therefore, you cannot separate women from agriculture, from agribusiness. They are inextricably interlinked. And nothing is as important and as foundational as land rights and agribusiness for women of the world. And nothing is more important for women in Tanzania, where 70% of women in Tanzania live in rural areas, than agribusiness, agriculture, and land. Commemorating women and land and rural women yesterday, the CEDAW Committee, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, stated that land rights of rural women are essential to the enjoyment of the full range of women's human rights. So it's land rights are not just about women's access or enjoyment of land rights, but it is also about the freedom of movement, the freedom of expression, the rights to family, rights to free expression, the right to tax benefits, banking credit, equal property rights, equal inheritance rights. So land rights for women bring together a holistic landscape of other rights for women. And women's business in agribusiness cannot take place in a vacuum. In a legal environment that limits women's autonomy and agency, or limits women's free movement, unequal access to resources, banking credit, tax benefits, or unequal access to marry, whom to marry, when to marry, whether to marry. All of these rights are inextricably interlinked to women's access to business, to economic resources, and land. And that is why I would like to look at the importance of gender equality in the legal landscape as a whole, and to locate women's business and women's agribusiness within that holistic framework. Because as I said before, gender equality translates into good business, and that is at the core of good business practices. This also includes women's access to justice. If women are not able to vindicate their rights to land, to freedom of movement, to inheritance, to property, the right to open a bank account in their own name, the right to legal guardianship of their children, women do not have the right to the autonomy to run their own businesses. As a woman in Lebanon once told me, if a woman cannot be head of a household, how can she be head of a Fortune 500 company or a head of a country? So women's right to be the head of a household, the woman's right to hold land in her own name, forms the core of a woman's rights or woman's autonomy in agribusiness. So with that in mind, what I want to do is to very quickly look at some of the reformist initiatives in Tanzania concerning equal rights for women, both in the family and in the public sector, and look at ways in which women in agribusiness, all of you, can play a leadership role in informing and shaping public policies that will create an enabling environment for women in business. As my colleagues will reinforce, women in business have a central role to play in shaping public policies. And women in public policy have a cardinal role to play in creating an enabling environment for their sisters in the private sector. And that synergy and that correlationship has to be reinforced by your leadership, starting from today. So when we look at the Tanzanian constitution, you have an equal protection provision that is central to your work. But despite the equal protection guarantee in the Tanzanian constitution, we do see that there is some inequality in the legal provisions and in the legal framework. And it is important for women in business to address those flaws, those gaps in the laws, as part of the public policy work that you need to be engaged in. So, for example, under the equal rights in the family, the Tanzanian law allows for the minimum age of marriage to be 15 for women and 18 for men. So there in that lies an inequality. The legal age for both men and women internationally, as guaranteed both by the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is age 18. And that cannot be eroded. So it is important that you look at those inequalities in the legal framework in Tanzania and play a leadership role in raising the age of marriage. Child marriage for women has played a major role in school dropout rates for girls in Tanzania and around the world, in the ways in which reproductive health rights of women and girls have suffered, the ways in which HIV/AIDS has spread across the African continent. So raising the age of marriage is a cardinal responsibility for women in business and in public policy. Secondly, despite the fact that Tanzania has promulgated a law that addresses sexual abuse, there is yet to be forged a law on violence against women and domestic violence. And Tanzania is one of the few countries that lacks a national legal framework on violence against women. And when we look at some of the barriers to women in business, some of the barriers to women in public service, violence against women is one of the chief impediments, is one of the greatest challenges that inhibits women from achieving the full potential of their lives. So addressing violence against women as a major leadership and public policy and even a business practice is an important part of what you will do. Customary laws in Tanzania also restrict a woman's property rights. However, the 1999 Land Rights Act in Tanzania gave women the right to obtain access to land, including the right to own, use, and sell land, and it also mandates joint titling of land. Secondly, the Village Land Act ensures that women are represented on land allocation committees and land administration councils. To me, that is imperative. The fact that women can play a leadership role in village councils and in village committees that allocate land is an enormously powerful leadership role at the village level, at the community level, that provides women access to decision making and access to power. And as businesswomen and as women in agribusiness, playing a leadership role in allocation of land, equal allocation of land for both men and women, is at the heart of leadership. So these are some of the key elements of a legal system that can either broaden your access to leadership or hinder your access to power, decision making, and leadership. So what I would like you to do in the next few days, as well as in the coming months, and in our future engagements with you, is to examine closely the legal framework in a holistic fashion and identify some of the barriers in the framework that inhibit women's leadership and agency both in the public and the private sector. I would also like you to identify the areas that provide you the ways and the skills to broaden your potential, to push the frontiers of women's leadership, such as the land titling law, which allows for co-ownership and the co-use of land as a way to advance and enhance your leadership both in agribusiness and in public policy. So I hope today starts you on a journey where you see yourself as standard bearers for your sisters in your community, in the region, and in the world, where you will play a leadership role both in agribusiness, in public policy, in decision making, and in politics. Thank you.
Well, Raj, please share some thoughts with us as we continue in this conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Katrin, and thank you for having me on this panel today as well, Mangita and Katrin. I'll speak to a topic really that is important across the world, is how do we make public institutions more effective? And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, having worked on worked in a private sector role as well as in my nonprofit role, working with institutions on how do you really apply good basic management practices to make public institutions more successful. And that's really important for the private sector as well, because as we know that looking at all the different challenges that any society faces, public institutions play a big role. And there was a recent article in Harvard Business Review about tri-sector leaders and the importance of tri-sector leadership. And it really emphasizes a point that it's really important for government, private sector, and social organizations as well as leadership to come together to solve the big challenges we face today. So it really becomes important for not just government leaders, but also private sector leaders, social sector leaders, to think about how do we make public institutions more successful, more effective in solving problems, and also what role can we play. So I'll just cover that for a few minutes here and give you some of the basics that we've uncovered based on the work that I've been doing with the team, and then we can get into some of the details if required. So what I want to speak to specifically is how do you create public value? And public value, the term public value is really not that different from, say, shareholder value, which most of us have probably heard of. And public value is really, in a public setting, how do you create value for your customers? So if we talk about the concept of customers, it's really about customers in terms of citizens. It could be other constituents, such as different set of stakeholders. And creating public value is about ultimately understanding and measuring the value, the return on investment that is created by public institutions. And ROI, of course, is something that may be a difficult and abstract measure in a public setting, but still there are ways that we've seen that you can actually measure when you start to develop really measures that can be measures understood based on cost per outcome. So I'll speak to really the key principles on measuring public value. Then finally, I'll also speak to good management. So getting to public value and generating public value and effective results really starts with applying basic, proven good management practices. And what are those set of practices that can be applied in public settings? And how do we really help, again, public institutions not only acquire the talent, but become much better at taking policy, first designing better policy, and then to taking that policy to execution, which is where we see the biggest challenges, not just designing policy, but how do you take policy and effectively execute? And so, there's, just to kind of also frame this around why is this really important, again, going back to the importance of public institutions, too often the focus when we talk about government institutions is on waste, fraud, and abuse. And what we really need to do from that standpoint is to turn that dialogue around and start to really talk about, instead of stopping waste, fraud, and abuse, how do we create more value for citizens? So what are the basic principles to getting there? That's I'd like to talk about 4 specific things that, again, that we've defined that any public institution can start to apply. So, those key principles start with, really, as business leaders, anybody can relate to, it's having a good plan and really articulating what are the set of goals. What are you in the business of doing? And so when we talk about any program, any government program, or any public institution, it's really about what we'll define as identifying outcomes. So any public program, or any program for that matter, should start with defining outcomes, not just goals, because a lot of times goals we've seen get focused on what are throughput measures or activity measures. So how many people did we train, for instance? But do we actually know what's the purpose of that training, right? So what outcome are we really trying to achieve? So it's really important to define outcomes, not outputs. And it's really important when outcomes are defined as part of that, that they're defined in a collaborative fashion with your stakeholders really participating with you. So in any different program, you have to really think about who are the set of customers. So if we're actually putting a program in, for instance, to strengthen agribusiness, who are the set of stakeholders that will ultimately be affected? What are the set of policies or legislation or government laws, legal frameworks that will be put in place? But before we can put them in place, we need to make sure that we have a real dialogue around what does success look like from an outcome standpoint, and how do we get there, and how is success defined by the different set of stakeholders? So that's one of the things that we see as a common fault. We start with output and activity measures, and then we don't engage stakeholders. So this is where it's really important when we start to see movement around a certain legislative or legal framework or certain policy, that the people that will be affected start to proactively pursue, if they're not being pursued, an ability to provide input. The second principle is around allocating resources to those highest priorities or outcomes. So that's another issue from a problem standpoint, is that what we see is that a lot of times resources, and we know that resources are scarce at this point, and so we need to be able to effectively allocate resources to the right set of priorities, but a lot of times they're allocated based on, say, a political preference, or because some special interest group had a bigger say, or you might just have had more say because you had lobbyists working with you. And so how do we really engage from that standpoint? One, the public in defining those outcomes or those set of constituencies that are really effective, and then make sure then we prioritize accordingly and allocate resources and our public dollars to those set of outcomes. So that's the second principle. Once we've started allocating to the right set of resources, or we've defined the outcomes, allocating to the right resources, the third step really is measuring effectiveness. So that's, again, that goes back to execution. So a lot of times now we've set up a program, for instance, or set up a legislation. We've created some legal framework, and we've started to implement a program. But continuously now measuring how well it's working, and of course, in a lot of social and public programs, that's a difficult thing to do, and there might be a long-term effect or a long study on that. So you can establish leading indicators along the way, but really it's important to start measuring effectiveness. And from that standpoint, the key measure, ultimate measure that we're looking for, and we should look for in all public programs, is cost per outcome. And what that tells us is, because that allows you to really put multiple programs that may be working towards the same goal and start to look at them from a standpoint of how effective and efficient are they. Are there programs that may be more effective, say, at creating more jobs or educating more students? So we have to not just look at measure effectiveness of each program by themselves, but also be able to compare in terms of cost per outcome. So then we can start to say, where do we allocate in terms of those programs? And then the last principle is really about innovation and continuous improvement. It goes back to effective execution. What we've seen is public institutions struggle with that for many reasons. And the more that we as stakeholders, as participants, whether we're from the inside or from the outside, can help government execute and really challenge the way that programs are being set up, and as we measure, think about what works, what doesn't, what are the set of management practices, whether we're talking about how do you design an organization to how do you design mundane processes, again, things that may not be as sexy as, say, public policy, but things that are really critical to effective execution and generating public value. Getting to that is really important, and so innovating and continuous improvement and applying really proven management practices, not practices that ad hoc we may have heard of, but real evidence-based practices. That's really important. So really those are the 4 key principles that ultimately allow us to get to generating more public value. And again, public value is really important from a standpoint of solving a lot of complex challenges, and so we want to start really changing that dialogue from waste, fraud, and abuse to how do we create and how do we partner with public sector to create more public value.
Thank you, Raj. And on that note of innovation and public value, I'd like Shelley to speak about the importance of innovation in technology, in entrepreneurship, and in public-private partnerships in creating public value as well as women's leadership.
I would love to. Now, Can I go up there, or is it better from here?
I think it's fine there.
Here?
If you
No,
want to, you could.
either is fine. So, essentially what I wanted to talk about today is why, our path to global economic development is truly based in the empowering of women and girls, and how technology as the greatest equalizer of the 21st century will enable us to basically do that. So, I'm going to read a quote, and this may sound familiar. You should tell me who said this. To achieve the economic expansion we all seek, we need to unlock a vital source of growth that can power our economies in the decades to come. By increasing women's participation in the economy, enhancing their efficiency and productivity, we can have a direct, dramatic impact on the competitiveness and the growth of our economies. Secretary Clinton said this in 2011 at the first ever Asia-Pac Economic Cooperation Dialogue in San Francisco. And essentially, I 100% agree with this. I am that woman that she's talking about. I was raised in India. I was born in India, raised here in the U.S. by immigrant parents. And they came here. They had to start over. They had to achieve financial opportunity. But the one thing that was available from the get-go was the opportunity to succeed and to do well. And for me, that opportunity was based in my educational opportunities, and especially in technology, and especially in an education that started at home based in STEM. So, all this to say that the rooting of STEM and critical thinking is the most important thing that we can give to young girls as they go forward, and then help them become those women that Sheryl Sandberg talks about so much, and help them to lean into their careers in a technology and critical thinking based career. I want to talk a little bit about how I have worked in tech and business, and then made the transition over into policy and politics. So thanks to my introduction of math and science at home, I feel that I'm one of those lucky people who was able to make that transition from my education into an area that I truly love, and which is politics, right? So politics, and to the point that I'm able to apply my background, and I'm able to work with members of Congress to create STEM advisory councils where I'm able to advise members and electeds on the importance of cybersecurity. And most importantly, for me, I'll give you an example. Last year, I had an opportunity to work to the point of drawing that transition between education, tech, and policy. I worked with a client of mine in San Francisco, and this client was about to be regulated and was going to be shut down if they didn't follow certain government procedures and regulations. And to the point of just technology outpacing our policy, we were able to connect the dots between Silicon Valley, the halls in Silicon Valley, and offices in Congress, and the right stakeholders in the public and private arenas, and we were able to work with them to get the Jobs Act passed. And there was nothing more empowering to me than to see my client in the Rose Garden and when the Jobs Act was signed by the president. So I think that that was a true example of how we can make the transition, how someone in business was able to work with another team in business, and then able to impact policy that has impacted the masses, truly hundreds and thousands of jobs going forward. So, the other thing that I really want to focus on is, despite my formal education and my family's influence, I found my way into my passion of politics and public policy and public service by accident. But we really cannot leave to chance. But we really cannot leave to chance what we are going to be doing for future generations to come. It behooves us to play a more active role, and like any other success in life, we have to plan for it, we have to nurture it, we have to design our global talent STEM pipeline. Otherwise, it's not going to happen, and it's definitely going to play an active role in the empowerment of women and girls. Sadly, though, women are highly underrepresented in the ranks of STEM. And in general, here in the U.S., we aren't graduating enough women in STEM, much less women in the area where you might even guess is a smaller percentage of this group. So currently at this time, I'm disheartened by the stat that I'm about to tell you, which is only 20% of CIOs of women in Fortune 250 are women in Fortune 250 companies. And although this is disheartening, I do feel an obligation to play a bigger role in raising this number. I had the honor recently of discussing this issue with the president, and I talked to him about the fact that in 2011, that India graduated 500,000 engineers, China graduated 1 million, and we in the U.S. graduated less than 100,000 engineers. And of course, the answer that he gave me was, we need to take STEM to every to every child at the earliest age possible, but not just in this country, globally. And I was pretty, that was very exciting for me to hear that from a world leader. So, but in addition to education, the other critical resource that we are missing is mentorship. Okay, so women, we cannot be what we cannot see, right? So women have to stand up. We as women, currently women, in our careers of influence, of experience, we have the ability to reach out and to help shape our future generations, especially around tech, to guide them in what they need to do. Otherwise, again, if they can't see something, they don't know it, and people learn by example, and that is the best way to teach. So we as mentors have an obligation to play a critical role in opening doors for young people and bringing them into the world, especially women, into those areas, whether it's politics, food distribution, whether it's law enforcement, whatever it is, critical thinking is needed across the board. Thanks.
Thank you, Shelley. And, on the note of the importance, the imperative of mentorship, I want to bring it back to the importance of the Women in Public Service project that was launched by the Secretary to envision a world where 50% of all public service and all decision making and political offices are filled by both men and women on an equal basis. So 50 by 50 is our charge and our mission, and it is inspired by the need to inspire and to share the torch of leadership with a new generation of women. New generation of women leaders in STEM, in agribusiness, and in public policy and public service opportunities and jobs. And we see all of you, women leaders and emerging women leaders in Tanzania, as the bearers of that torch. And you will share the torch with a new generation of women to whom you will blaze a trail, not just for women in Tanzania, but for women around the world. And with that, I want to turn to my colleague, Catherine, to look at ways in which today's discussion can be brought together in a framework that you can use in your conversations and in your dialogue in the next in the next day or two, and will help to jumpstart an enduring program with us at the Women in Public Service Project.
Thank you, Rangita. That's exactly what I was hoping to do, to draw together the wonderful speakers we've just heard from and to set the stage for what we're going to be discussing this afternoon and going forward in this project. I think Rangita did a beautiful job of talking about the larger framework for the legal issues that face women. And these are issues that sometimes are very real. They are sometimes elements of the legal framework that need to be looked at much more closely. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through some of the issues in particular that we know have been raised by women entrepreneurs in the agricultural sector. And I hope that you will tell us about your experiences, though, so that we can make this a much richer discussion as we go forward. But I also really am grateful to Raj for talking about the institutional frameworks and the ways in which public policy is made in a participatory fashion, because I think one of the challenges, too, is that often, even if there are rights that women have, that perhaps the process around enforcing and implementing those rights is not as robust as it could be. And then Shelley, I think, has done a lovely job of telling us about the potential for women and how women can get more engaged in different sectors and mentorship and how important that is, and where some of the opportunities are, I think, in different sides of the industry. And one of the things I think that's so fascinating about agriculture, which is what we're here talking about, is that it really encompasses so many different elements. 80% of the women in Tanzania are involved in the agricultural sector. And I think that this is something, though, that everybody needs to think about, because as we think about how to encourage innovation and partnership in agriculture, we really need to think about women's roles, their current roles, and where those possibilities are that perhaps are untapped. As I said at the outset, we are here to have a week of discussions on the Center of Excellence for Transformational Partnerships. This is a transformational partnership that we are launching here today. And we hope that this is something that we can continue to work with you on over the course of the next year through field consultations, through another session that we would like to have next summer to develop some next steps in the projects, and also through a legal guide for women entrepreneurs that we are working on in collaboration with another partner, the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. So I'm grateful to our partners today, to the Finnish government, to the World Bank, to my fellow panelists. And what I want to do, just really briefly to set the stage for the conversation that we're about to have, is relate back to some of the issues along the agricultural value chain and connect those with some of the elements that we've heard about today. So I won't spend too much time on any of these things, but what I'd like to do is give a little bit of a framework for how the agricultural sector tends to interact with women's leadership and this tremendous potential that I've talked about already several times. So Rangita already set the stage to talk about land. This is obviously a critical issue, and there's no way to talk about agriculture and improvements in agriculture and expansion of the agricultural sector without talking about land. It's central to women. I think Rangita told us that under the Tanzanian constitution, women do have access to land and property. Yet there still is this tension in Tanzania and in many other places as well between customary law and formal law. And so even if some of these protections are enshrined in the constitution, there's another legal system almost in place that sometimes can make the administration very complex. The World Bank reports that it still takes on average 68 days to register land, that there are 8 steps in the process, and going through a very complex process like that can be difficult for anyone, particularly for farmers and women in rural areas. 20% of the landholders on the record in Tanzania are women, only 20%. And of that, the primary holders of land is a much smaller percentage for women. So clearly there still are some issues that need to be worked through. As I said, as I think Rangita told us at the beginning, right now we're focusing on rural agriculture and looking at where women are participating in the agricultural sector. Most women are working in rural areas in agriculture still, and men do tend to still have the primary responsibility for cash crops. So there needs to be a bit of a shift there, but without finding some good, concrete, workable solutions to some of the challenges around land ownership, it will be difficult to move forward. Land ownership really tends to impact just about every aspect of the agricultural value chain, and I'll say just a little bit more about that as we go. I do also want to point out that inheritance rights are also an issue, and that here this is a place where the formal legal system doesn't really protect women, and that also is something that I hope we can talk more about and that needs to be addressed. Access to finance is something that everybody talks about when we discuss agriculture, but without being able to hold collateral and clear title to land, which is often the form of collateral that's used, it's very difficult to get access to loans, to equity financing, to credit, to insurance. And so this is something that then has implications and reverberations throughout the value chain. So any type of activity, whether it's enhancing production or moving into value-added processing or services delivery, is impacted by the ability to get access to financing, which is then also a big part of the issues around land, which we've talked about. One thing that I'll just mention really briefly, and I hope that we can discuss a bit this afternoon, where some creative solutions maybe have emerged in addressing access to financing. Obviously, microcredit is one. Working through cooperatives and cooperative financing is another, but there are legal issues around co-ops as well, even though Tanzania does have established financing institutions for cooperatives, but there are ways in which that system could be strengthened. I think that there are other models we can look at as well. Leasing financing is another that gets around some of the challenges with collateral, but we can talk about that a bit more as the conversation goes forward. One other thing, too, to flag here is employment, which is also governed by customary law. And because women do not often have recourse under formal employment contracts, they sometimes are subject to lower wages, which is another tension between the formal legal system and the informal legal system. That's something that we really need to think about carefully. Now, women don't participate in the agricultural sector just as producers of agriculture. There's also a whole robust, or should be a whole robust series of a network of services around agriculture. This includes transportation, distribution, it includes financial services, wholesale, retail, every aspect of business activity. And these can be tremendous opportunities for women, but sometimes cultural norms can prevent women from participating in those sectors, just as legal requirements that make it very difficult to enter those sectors, and this is true in every aspect of services that I just mentioned, can sometimes make it hard for just about anybody to enter the sector, all but some of the largest companies. And not only does this cut off possible opportunities for for diversifying employment, but it also means that sometimes the services that are offered won't really respond to the needs of those in the market. So they might not be designed to respond to women's needs, where there's a tremendous opportunity as well for those who are delivering those services. There are all kinds of regulations around services which we can talk about that do restrict market entry, but I think that that's an important thing to think about as we talk about agriculture, because it is not just producing, it is also the whole system around agriculture that's needed to create a robust sector. Just really briefly, remittances are also an issue in this area. Not only are remittances part of the services sector in the sense that the money that's coming from remittances is coming from is coming from service activity that's delivered in other markets, but there's a whole services structure around remittances that's needed to be able to ensure that the money that's earned elsewhere goes back into the economy, and that women who earn that money are able to use it in ways that will help them and their families. So that's another element that I think that we need to really look carefully at, and the regulations around remittances. So another aspect in agriculture that is impossible to ignore are inputs like seeds and fertilizer. And I'll just really briefly say something about this, because I have actually, through my organization, been part of a public-private partnership in Tanzania that worked to bring new higher yielding seed varieties onto the market. I will say that this was a public-private partnership that took several years to see success, and it really was a true public-private partnership. It was a collaboration between the government of Tanzania and the private sector, a local company that was working to open up, in this case, the market for potatoes, where most of the producers, not surprisingly, are women, but where up until a few years ago, there were not high-yielding, good varieties of seeds on the market to produce potatoes. So most of those who were producing potatoes, about 150,000 small farmers, were using seeds that were not getting yields that were high enough to actually sell in any commercial quantity. And so potatoes were coming in from another market in Africa and being sold in Tanzania, with the trucks turning around and going back empty, and no way for farmers in Tanzania to move out of this cycle. So what we did was work very closely, as I said, with this whole range of partners, and really worked through the legal process in a way that I think that Raj would highlight, step by step, interacting with policymakers, being part of the process, and working to get new seed varieties out into the market. We can talk more about that. I'll happily share more. There was a lot of detail that went into it, but it was a really, really interesting and really, I think, powerful partnership, and the type of thing that we can talk about today. And it really did require looking at it from all sides. But we, as we were going through that partnership, made sure that we were thinking about how women's needs were reflected in this as well. And one of the interesting things that happened was that as the investment became more successful, and as the farm was able to expand its operations, jobs were created for women. One of the partners built a greenhouse so that these very delicate seedlings could be handled properly. And the greenhouse, it turned out, was a place where it created some very appealing employment opportunities for women off of the traditional farming opportunities. So I think that there are so many different aspects of this that we should think about. Processing is something in all of these sectors, as we try to think about how the agricultural sector can hold more value. Processing of any product, whether it's potatoes turning into potato chips, or other agricultural products reaching a more value-added stage, is something that's going to be important. But the technology for processing is still lacking, and something that we need to really think carefully about. Storage is also an issue. A lot of agricultural produce perishes before it can reach the market, and finding proper storage, and finding storage that women can use and access and afford, is going to be an important part of this. And then finally, the market system itself, which I really talked about quite a bit anyway, but I think that it is important to think about all of these aspects as part of the market. Markets are regulated, and those regulations can be very complex. It can be very complicated to cross a border. It can be very complicated to comply with standards. And in agriculture, there are a lot of standards that need to be complied with very closely. And this is a place where smaller producers can find it challenging to find access to the information they need, the training they need, Just getting to the markets themselves can be a challenge, and obviously this is something that will impact a number of women. But it is a place, though, where there are a lot of ways that we can find good solutions to work through some of those issues. So I'm going to leave it at that, and then very briefly say that what we'd like to do then with the rest of the conversation is talk through some of these things. And I'm sure that there are things that Rangita and I haven't talked about that you would like to bring to the table, but really for us to think through carefully what is needed to make the agricultural sector and women's role in the agricultural sector transformational, and how do all of these different aspects of it relate to that? What's happening now, what could be happening, and what are some of the challenges that we need to forge good partnerships to try to overcome? So this is just the start of a process. We are going to be continuing the conversation today and throughout the week on different aspects of this, including with our partners, as I've mentioned before. And then we'll come back and do additional consultations. We'll go out into the field and find ways, we hope, to talk to women entrepreneurs about the challenges that they see on a day-to-day basis. And we'll bring this all together, both into a tool and into a workshop that we will do in partnership, that Rangita and I will do next summer, we hope. That can also produce some good next steps for continuing this conversation and our collaboration. So again, thank you for participating in this. We're very excited to be having this conversation and look forward to hearing from all of you.
We've really benefited from the power of voices of leaders, both men and women. And this has been transformational to me, and I know to all of you too. What I want to do very briefly is to weave together what Katrine just shared with all of you and with us here at the Wilson Center, and located within a framework of women's leadership and women's decision making. You know, she spoke of the importance of women's access to fertilizer. And in Malawi, there is evidence-based research produced by the World Bank that shows that when women have equal access to fertilizer, productivity grows by 30%. So women in decision making, women in leadership is important, not just for women, but it impacts the bottom line, it impacts development goals, and it impacts the community and the country. I also want to speak about the transformative power of women's leadership in issues such as inheritance that Katrine so evocatively brought to the forefront. You know, women's inheritance rights is at the core of women's ownership and women's access to land. And in Rwanda, the ways in which women took a lead in reforming the inheritance law regime was through their political leaders. As you know, Rwanda is the only country in the world that has a majority of women in their parliament. And at 56% is the only country in the world that boasts of an equal number and more than equal number of women in a legislative body. And when the women in parliament located inheritance law as the most fundamental area for reform, what they did was that they formed a coalition to reform the law, but they also understood the value of forging partnerships, as Raj and the other speakers have said, with men, with male leaders, and bringing to the table male champions of change. And so what they did was that they addressed this issue in Parliament and spoke to the male leaders, the male hierarchies, as this being an issue that would impact not just women, not just the next generation, but the country. And gaining that leadership, the leadership of men and women in Parliament, was important for women in agriculture. And that is such a quintessentially important and powerful example of women in agriculture building constituencies with women in public service, in politics, not just women, but with the male leadership, and forging a transformative, innovative initiative that would revolutionize agriculture, women's lives, men's lives, and the future of their countries. So on that note, I want to thank our speakers, our leaders who have joined us, Shelley Kapoor Collins and Raj Sharma, who have really shown the value of public service in the ways in which they have dedicated their time, their passion to this work for the Women in Public Service project, the World Bank's project, as well as the project that is spearheaded by Catherine and the German Marshall Fund. And once again, I cannot be thrilled enough to partner with you, Catherine, on this exciting journey that we have started on today. Thank you.